Welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us today. We are very proud to continue the INSEAD Strategy Foundational Interview Series by Zoom this year with David Teece, Professor of Business Administration of University of California at Berkeley, and Chairman and Principal Executive Officer of Berkeley Research Group. Just as a little background, the Foundational Series is a tradition that was started by Professor Gabriel Zulansky about a decade back, and it consists of interviews where INSEAD PhD students meet with accomplished scholars to talk about their ideas that shape the field of knowledge and innovation research. In this session, I, Naja Pape, along with my colleague Sukti Ghosh, both second-year PhD students in management at INSEAD, will be in conversation with David Teece. And as you know, David Teece is one of those scholars who require very little introduction. He has published more than 300 articles and books, an impressive body of work that has shaped the way management scholars think about topics such as competitive strategy, intellectual property, technology transfer, profiting from innovation, and economic development, to name a few. Consequently, Professor Teece is the most voted foundation scholar by the Knowledge and Innovation Division of the Strategic Management Society, as well as recognized and ranked #1 globally in business and management in a composite ranking across many fields of science based on citation counts. An academic maverick, Professor Teece's research trajectory has been anything but ordinary, characterized by intellectual risk and interdisciplinary research in pursuit of, by his own admission, the big hairy problems in business, and contributing to the fundamental questions in the field of strategic management, how firms get to be and stay great. We contacted Richard Rumelt, another eminent scholar and one of David Teece's esteemed friends and colleagues, who characterized him as one of the very few economics-trained scholars that thinks and writes about business in realistic terms. Rumelt believes that while most economists are trapped by their models and take what he calls an overweening pride in metamization, David, he notes, luckily has a foothold in both worlds, the one of academia and the one of practice. In this interview, Professor Teece will provide us with insights into both his scholarly and entrepreneurial journey, from the launch of his first venture long before he joined graduate school, to scholars who informed his academic curiosity and the story behind how starting out a career in the 1970s California proved to be fertile ground for his canonical work on dynamic capabilities and competitive advantage. On a practical note, we will monitor the chat for any clarifying questions during the conversation, and if time permits, open up for a few broader questions at the end. So let's get started, shall we, David?
Hello.
It seems to us that many people associate your name directly with the notion of dynamic capabilities, which makes sense because it is your most cited work. We'll get back to that concept a little bit later, but if you were to introduce your curious work and the journey that you have undertaken as a scholar over the past years to younger scholars and researchers, what perspectives would you like to give them? What aspects and contribution would you like to emphasize?
Yes, that's a very good question. I believe that research should focus on fundamental questions. Now, obviously, if you're a young researcher, that's a steep mountain. But at the same time, you don't have to answer everything about a fundamental question, but you have to be able to relate your research to a fundamental question, whether it's competitive advantage and how it's captured, or how it's built and how it's sustained, or whether it's, the theory of the firm, which has really, animated a lot of what I do. You've got to have these big questions in mind. And that's for two reasons. One is, at the end of the day, you want people to be interested in your research. And if you go off into some narrow little topic, your audience is never going to be particularly big. But secondly, the way that knowledge grows over time is by people chipping away at hard problems. So my advice, and what I've tried to do myself, is follow the mantra of let's focus on the big questions: competitive advantage, diversification, integration, coordination, leadership, whatever it is. Let's look at the big questions. But it's okay to take bite-sized pieces, but keep the big question in mind always, and make sure your big question is a fundamental question.
So with that in mind, then you will, if you do tackle the big, hairy questions, then you will contribute both to shareholder wealth and the wealth of nations. That is the message that...
Yes, I mean, in essence, what's behind my research is trying to understand, one, how do firms get to be profitable and stay that way, and how do they get to create value for society? And then secondarily, if you've got that figured out, then you can make some contribution to understanding the wealth of nations. You know, Alfred Chandler, the famous business historian, says you can't have wealthy nations unless you've got prosperous and wealthy and productive firms. And yet the economic development literature kind of misses that bit out. So there's a place here for strategic management scholars. And yes, behind my research, it's the same question that Adam Smith asked, 250 years ago. What is it that can help us understand and explain the wealth of nations, and in particular, the wealth of firms? So the bite-sized piece that I've taken is the wealth of firms. Now, just think of the constituencies that are interested in that. National governments are interested in that. Managers, of course, are interested in that. Investors are interested in that. The whole world is interested in that, to the extent to which they're interested in increasing prosperity and finding, better ways to organize economic life. So always have those big questions in mind, and then I think you'll find your research is more relevant, and the audience for it is likely to be broader.
You started out your first entrepreneurial journey while still in university, and you're still as much a scholar as much an entrepreneur. And we're curious to know what made you pursue a PhD and choose an academic career in the first place, instead of focusing wholly on your entrepreneurial instinct.
Well, if I remember correctly, when I applied to the PhD program at Wharton, it was a PhD program in economics, I think I said on my application that my career path was the World Bank. So I was actually thinking of economic development and international economics. And I wasn't thinking of academia. I wasn't thinking of being an entrepreneur. I was thinking of being a young professional in the World Bank. And maybe one day I will be a professional in the World Bank, but I won't be a young one if I ever make it there. But my interest changed when I was in graduate school. And I would say the key reason for that is exposure. I was very, very lucky to be a student of Edwin Mansfield. And Mansfield was a scholar in innovation, the only economist, quite frankly, one of a very small number of economists that were focused on economics, technological change, and in his case, industrial research. And that opened my eyes to the private sector, because the private sector was where most of the innovation was coming from, even if it was funded in part by government. So I really started to get more of a private sector focus. I got interested in business firms. And so my interest in the World Bank waned. And then I was unsure what I was going to do. And the uniform advice was, if you're not sure what you're going to do, then you should take an academic job, because you'd always have the option to do something else later. So I found that to be appealing, but I didn't think I had a chance. But it turned out I had quite a number of good chances. And so the rest is history. But I went into the academic world really of two minds. That was going to be a launch pad for something else, although the something else wasn't clear.
So, of course, you mentioned Mansfield. And so we were curious to know, thinking about your academic journey over the years, what, in your opinion, have been some of the major influences on your work and your thinking as a scholar? Your advisors, Mansfield, Williamson, other academics, or even your own business experiences and conversations with students in the classroom?
It's all of the above. When I was a graduate student in New Zealand, we had a program of inviting visitors under a fellowship called the Erskine Fellowship. And so we had Charles Kindleberger come to visit. We had Gerald de Breuer, subsequently a Nobel laureate at Berkeley, and a lot of very famous economists. And I remember taking a class from Gerald de Breuer as an undergraduate in general equilibrium theory, and I could see the elegance of what he was doing, but then the theorem at the end was that socialism and capitalism are theoretically equivalent. And I thought, well, this obviously is a result of a model. It's not anything that reflects the real world, and it's a result of a model that doesn't have innovation in it. So I think I early on got exposed to the power of theorizing and the elegance of theorizing, but sometimes the relevance of it, was, left something to be desired. So they were early influences, and then coming to Penn, not just with Mansfield, but the young Oliver Williamson was a tenured professor there at that time, and Irvin Kravis in international, and a fellow called Elmarin Phillips in industrial organization. And these people were very, very influential. Williamson, because he was breaking out of the standard sort of neoclassical economics, and that was very exciting for me. And sadly, I never took a class from him because he was visiting abroad at that time. But the fact that he was there and there was a buzz amongst the graduate students, and I found, the early markets and hierarchies very readable. Most people said this stuff is incomprehensible, but my early career was explaining to other people what Williamson was trying to say, because he loved to use archaic vocabulary and big words and so forth, but that didn't daunt me at all. But there's no question that selecting a good mentor or being selected by a mentor, if you're lucky, which is what happened with Mansfield. He actually took me to lunch and asked me if I would be, he offered himself as an advisor, which was a wonderful thing. And that was a stroke of luck, but an awkward one, because there was no constituency. Back in those days, there was no constituency in economics for the study of industrial research. That was not the hot stuff. It was all about macro modeling and welfare theorems and what have you. So I knew that I wasn't going to get very far as an economist on the coattails of Mansfield. And so I saw the opportunity with Williamson, who was, a young Turk, if you will, in the law and economics area. And so, I wasn't being strategic about it. I just found it all very interesting. And so I rode the coattails of Mansfield and Williamson in particular, and also other people in the department. Steve Ross, who was, now passed away very sadly, but was a young Turk in the area of finance and financial theory. So I got a tremendously valuable education by just really smart people that were pioneers in their field. And that really took me quite some distance.
And I suppose the Carnegie School in the 50s, 60s also touched you in some ways?
Well, yes, when I reflect on it. And so it's not only the professors, but it's also the workshops that were held. And Williamson was running the workshop one year, and Phillips another year. And, they invited people like Richard Nelson and Sidney Winter. And that's how I got to meet them. They were, friends from the Carnegie School days. So in a way, the Carnegie School, which in the 60s under Lee Bach, B-A-C-H, who was the dean, he brought in or corralled March and Simon and Sayert and Mansfield and Winter and Nelson, all of these great people that have been so influential, not just on my career, but on the field. They came together. It was just a short burst of like 15 years at the Carnegie School. These periods of great intellectual creativity are often quite brief because of special circumstances and special people come together. I like to think subsequently at Berkeley, we had a 25-year run of a similar kind in the PhD program in strategy and innovation at Berkeley. But in a way, I picked up March and Simon through Williamson in particular, because while he departed from them, he clearly appreciated what they'd done, and more importantly, they came through as visitors. And I offered myself to go to the airport and pick these people up, and they were very happy. And that's how you got a free audience with Herbert Simon or Sidney Winter or Richard Nelson, or go to the train station and bring them up to campus. As a diligent graduate student, I had the fortune of being able to chat, quietly about ideas with these absolutely brilliant people. And sometimes today I lament the fact that we don't have that density. At least I don't have that density of brilliant people around to draw on, because some of them have gone, but some of them are still here, thank goodness. And that was influential. So yes, I'm an echo of the Carnegie School, or a grandchild of the Carnegie School, however you want to put it, particularly with respect to the respect for interdisciplinary research and for behavioral economics. Now, of course, behavioral economics is almost passé now, but back then, a behavioral perspective was not common. So it is important who you have access to, and it's not necessarily that you're going in and getting questions answered by them. It's the very fact that you get to meet them and you read them, you're excited by their work, and you go read it. I mean, 98% of what I've learned from these people is not from verbal conversations, it's from reading their work. But you go, when you're flipping the pages as written by somebody who you've met, at least to me, it's way more meaningful than if it's just, a dry and dusty book. So that close personal contact was part of the ethos that shaped what I was able to subsequently do. And also gave me the courage. The other thing is, you need the courage to step out of line. And the Carnegie School, stepped out of line and was trying to create a new paradigm for the study of organizations. And they did create a new paradigm for the study of organizations. So you got to see up front that you step out of line with very good people in very smart ways, you can get very good things done.
And what about your early teaching experiences? Any influences of those?
Yes, well, my first academic job was at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. And, I was teaching microeconomic theory. And I was very excited about standard microeconomic theory because, it was kind of fun. And, at the same time, I was aware of some of its deficiencies, particularly around the theory of the firm. But the students, of course, were all on average, 5 to 10 years older than I was. And they were also more worldly than I was. And they were aware of what was going on, more aware of what was going on in the business news, I'm sad to say, than I was at the time, or that had jobs. And so they knew well what went on in organizations. So they would ask me very good questions. And the answers weren't in the textbooks. I mean, my fallback was the literature in the textbooks, which I knew pretty well. And so I had to quickly decide, was there something wrong with their questions, or was there something wrong with the textbooks and the literature? And I quickly determined the problem was the literature and the textbooks. So I, in my own way, set my mind to, well, we got to rewrite the textbooks in microeconomics, at least for anyone with a serious interest in business. And, that led to early work on economies of scope and the scope of the enterprise. I started with an easy problem, which was understanding diversification. And the literature on that was really, Dick Romel's work was out there, but the economic literature was pretty very limited. There was a stronger literature on vertical integration, and Williamson was working that. So it was a natural thing to focus on diversification. Williamson wasn't working on it. He was looking at the vertical side, but I saw a way to take some of his ideas and apply it to, horizontal integration or lateral integration and diversification. So it was a small step, but I was able to quickly, make some headway because of where I'd been and seeing how other people had looked at related issues, but not the same issues. But it's obviously a big question. Diversification is, one of the key business questions of all times and will always remain so. So yes, the students helped me refocus my research agenda. It's not that I learned a lot from them in terms of ideas, is that I was provoked by them to go down a different path.
So, of course, this also came up now. And in one of your past conversations as well, you mentioned how your academic work has been a lifelong battle with mainstream economics, and your stance on the failure of neoclassical economics in explaining heterogeneity in firm performance. So what in your professional and personal experience influenced such a stance? I mean, yeah, you've mentioned something about the class as well and your discussions with the student, but was there anything else? But also, I guess, more importantly, how do you think your work on dynamic competition addresses these failures as you see them?
Okay, well, so just to review the drift of my work, I mean, yes, so early work was on diversification, the informal organization, economies of scope of the enterprise. And then there was a period when I looked at the profiting from innovation question, and then eventually through to dynamic capabilities. So as I understand your question is, what's dynamic capability? Where does that fit in? And in essence, all of these are efforts to try and come up with a better foundation for the theory of the firm. I know in the field of strategic management, people are looking at it through a managerial lens, but I'm actually always looking at things through two lenses. Yes, the managerial implications and the public policy implications, actually three lenses. The managerial implications, the public policy implications, and then the implications for theory itself. Because if you can really craft a more robust theory of the business enterprise, then you kind of, that truly is a major contribution, more so than any specific element. So dynamic capabilities is really an effort at one level to create a theory of the innovating firm, or a theory of the firm that's constantly improving and maintaining and strengthening its competitive advantage. And it's really about innovation, even though innovation's not in every paragraph. It's really about innovation and change. And in fact, the course I've taught at Berkeley for years has a subtitle, the economics of innovation and change. So that's what dynamic capabilities is, and all of the work, whether it's diversification, profiting from innovation, business models, all of these are sort of key elements of what needs to be in a theory of the firm. Of course, the challenge always with theory is, the simpler it is, the more powerful it is if it's a good theory. On the other hand, business firms are awfully complex things. And as Einstein once said, you should make things simple, but no simpler than they can be.
So, of course, dynamic environments and uncertainty also play a big role in your research. So how do you think being proximate to Silicon Valley influenced your research and subsequent interest in technology and innovation?
Well, that ties in with your prior question, actually. A lot of the students, both here at Berkeley and at Stanford, are interested in Silicon Valley, even if the faculty are not. The students are. And so I must say that, I mentioned earlier the influence of Mansfield, Williamson, and the Carnegie School. I would say on the other practical side, it's the heroes of Silicon Valley, whether Gordon Moore or Steve Jobs or Eugene Kleiner. Silicon Valley was still relatively young when I was, shaping my own research agenda in the 80s and 90s. And I had the good fortune of actually meeting many of these giants. Like Gordon Moore, for instance, I really was on a first name basis with him, and he came to my house on numerous occasions. And he was the founder of Intel. And wow, it just, if you hang out with these folks a little bit, you really get to understand the way they think. And it's a wonderful filter when you're looking at the literature. And the people that that scholars are trying to talk about and trying to review and understand the decisions they made. One filter is if you got a good theory. The other filter is do you actually know the people making the decisions and the circumstances under which those decisions were made. And the good fortune of living in Silicon Valley and on the edge of Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley now is everything from, the Marin County in the north through to through to Santa Clara in the south, and east to Alameda County here in the Bay Area. So in this milieu, there are these very interesting people, and they're fascinating people, and they're accomplishing big things. So there's no question that the opportunity to meet Steve Jobs, which I did have. I did have a lunch with Steve Jobs with a number of other colleagues, and many times with Gordon Moore, Eugene Kleiner, and Bill Spencer, who was running head of Xerox Research in Xerox PARC. It wasn't so much the individuals as the environment that they were in and the opportunity to sort of talk at firsthand about some of the things and some of the decisions that they had made, but to understand who they were as people as well.
So we have already touched quite a bit upon dynamic capabilities, but when discussing your scholarship, it is unavoidable not to dwell on your 97 article on dynamic capabilities that you published with Gary Pisano and Amy Schuin. So could you please tell us more about the ideation process behind it? You've previously mentioned in other interviews that it partly came from teaching microeconomics, but how did the idea take shape, and did you sense that you were on the verge of something that would be so widely cited?
The answer to the last part is no, but let me go to the first part. I mentioned teaching the MBA students at Stanford, but teaching the PhD students at Berkeley is really where the ideation process, I think, for dynamic capabilities came from. And Gary and Amy were both doctoral students at Berkeley. And, we were very familiar, and I was very familiar, as were they, through the curriculum with the work of Nelson and Winter and with the innovation literature. And Oliver Williamson, of course, by then was a major force on campus because I had recruited him to Berkeley from Yale, and Amy, she had a Harvard MBA, so she was very practical and focused on what real companies did. And Gary was sort of 1 foot in the real world, but he understood the theoretical literature, and we somehow rather started combining this together into this dynamic capabilities paper. And the reason it took so long is I didn't feel the paper. We had an early version of this paper in the early 90s, but I didn't feel it was worthy of publication, to tell you the truth, because it was dramatically incomplete. When I look back on it, the reason it was so incomplete is because the problem is so big, and we were biting off something way bigger than perhaps we should have. I mentioned earlier that when you attack fundamental issues, try and take them in small pieces. But we had taken a big bite into, okay, we're going to now build a theory of the competitive advantage of the business enterprise. Michael Porter hadn't tried to do that. His was industry analysis, and he was taking established industrial organization economics and try and turn that over into a tool that was useful for strategic management. He was able to do that, but he wasn't trying to explain the outcomes and the performance of particular firms. So no one had really tried to do that in a comprehensive way. So I now look back on it and realize that what we were trying to do is build a systems theory of the firm. So it sat around because it felt unelegant and it felt messy and it felt unfinished. And so a combination of that, plus the fact that I was out being an entrepreneur building companies. At that time, I built the Law and Economics Consulting Group. And the time from the first draft to the last draft, I built a $50 million company with some of my other colleagues at Berkeley. So we were very busy on many fronts. And in the end, what forced my hand a little bit is I knew it was important for Gary and Amy to get something published. But it was actually, I submitted it to the Strategic Management Journal, and it came back with good reviews, subject to minor revisions. But I let it sit. I didn't do the minor revisions because I thought it needed major revisions, not minor revisions. So it was eventually Dan Shandell called up to say, David, look, we only asked for minor revisions. This paper has really gotten out there. And Gary Bazzano was saying, it's everywhere. Please get it published. And Dick Ramel said, well, by the time it's out there, who cares? It's out there. What does it matter whether it's published or not? I balanced all of those things and in the end decided, well, okay, let's do one more revision on it and get it out. And I honestly didn't think it would take off quite the way it did. I think it sort of obviously filled a gap, and there was nothing else to compete with it. There was nothing else that was so ridiculously ambitious as that paper, and that's why it filled a gap. But even after it was published, I still felt very dissatisfied with it, and that's why in 2007 I did the Explicating Dynamic Capabilities as a way to tidy it up. It's the same ideas but expressed differently. Whenever you're dealing with a complex system, you can look at it from just about any different direction. You'll get, a different way of talking about it. And that's the nature of dynamic capabilities. It's hard because you've got a multidisciplinary exercise going on where you're trying to pull together threads from decision theory, from economics, from organizational behavior, from marketing, from business strategy. There's hardly a subfield of business and economics that's not in some way implicated in dynamic capabilities, and finding the right way to do that inside 30 or 35 pages is quite hard. So the answer is the ideation started, as many good things do, with interaction between students and faculty. And then also in the whispering in the back, of course, is Sid Winter and Dick Nelson in particular. I say Dick Nelson was probably he's always been incredibly encouraging of any young scholar that's trying to, and I was still a young scholar then, I suppose, trying to really grapple with important questions. And so I think I had some strong peer support. And that led to a little bit of extra effort, and the rest is history.
Indeed.
So we'll stay on your work on dynamic capabilities a little longer, and it has been the subject of ample debate and discussion. So if you had to speculate, why do you think that was the case? But more importantly, I guess you mentioned wanting to see the stream of work developing further and to be challenged by scholars working in this area. How would you like to see the framework evolve?
Yes, well, dynamic capabilities is really about the innovating firm. And so, the quest for all of my research is to have innovation and change front and center, because that is the nature of the world. That's the nature of the world we live in. It's the nature of the situation we need to be in if we're going to keep the economy dynamic and growing and prosperous and address social and economic problems of our time. So what I would ask for 2 or 3 things if I get to ask. One is keep the focus on the innovating firm. 2, recognize that the standard models are all about a world in which things are relatively predictable. And, the world that I'm theorizing about is one where there's deep uncertainty. And so a lot of the traditional models and formulations don't work in that circumstance. But the third thing that I hope people keep front and center is the need to be interdisciplinary. And when I say be interdisciplinary, there's a tremendous requirement to understand a lot of fields, all the fields of business. To be a great scholar in the field of strategic management, you've got to understand everything in the business school curricula, to varying degrees, or at least you have to have an appreciation. And for instance, I'm not an organizational behavior scholar, but I've thanked Charles O'Reilly for this. He was a colleague of mine at Berkeley for a number of years, and he really got me into the literature on culture and leadership and so forth, which of course gets no play whatsoever in economics. But I got some appreciation for that, and I enjoyed reading that and taking insights from it. And the transformation part of dynamic capabilities comes in there. Cognitive psychology comes in through the sensing and sense making. A lot of that is around, a lot of people see the same facts, but what they make of them are very, very different. And so, understanding cognition, understanding behavioral decision theory is also very, very important. And understanding, investment decision making and financial metrics and the way these things all play. I couldn't have done that paper 10 years earlier because I think my career is one where, I've learned more over time because I continue to read broadly and understand the world. And so my third ask is people be multidisciplinary and draw selectively and hopefully astutely from ideas that are outside whatever their primary discipline might be. So I think that's the only way that we're going to make dynamic capabilities better. The other thing that I would ask for, the academic world has this tremendous penchant for everyone wanting to do their own thing and a little bit of maybe one-upsmanship. Sometimes, there's benefit from sort of some amount of standardization and then building together through, joint research or research that's more or less in parallel. So the book I'm writing now is called Dynamic Capabilities and Related Paradigms, where I try to relate a lot of other paradigms out there to dynamic capabilities, like the lean startup, for instance, is just a special case of dynamic capabilities in a small company context. And I can go through just about every silver bullet, book that's in the airport bookstores, and I can show how that sort of fits in with dynamic capabilities because, I'm endeavoring to build a systems theory of the business enterprise. And so it should be able to accommodate these other ideas, but very few people spend the time, very few promoters of ideas spend the time trying to explain where their bit fits in. They usually want to tell you that it's for everything, when in fact it's not. With a bit of luck, there's a niche, a set of problems that the silver bullet idea is really good at helping you solve, but it's not everything. And so, spend some time, integrating ideas as well as creating new ones. And then, of course, empirically exploring. I don't necessarily say testing because some of this stuff is very hard to test. How would you test Darwin's Origin of the Species? Just because it's not, you can't set up on a Popperian sense doesn't mean to say it's not useful theory. It could be descriptive theory or what have you. So, but assembling, informative case studies and, data to test elements of it. Dan Lovallo and I have a piece in the Strategic Management Journal where we look at an aspect of dynamic capabilities, which is around the ability to move the cash in the company around so that the different business units can draw on the totality of the firm's resources, and it's not siloed. That actually improves performance too, and not just by a little bit, but quite a bit. So there are vignettes, empirical vignettes that you can bring to bear, and I hope that there's more work done along those lines as well.
Dynamic capabilities society, maybe, that could agree on certain standards and propositions?
It's society. Well, that's not a bad idea. I think I just appointed you president if you want to be. But yes, I think that these ideas belong to communities of people, basically, because communities of people have contributed a lot. Hundreds of people have now written on dynamic capabilities. And yes, I think that there would be some benefit from systemization, around definitions and around formulations too, because often many scholars are saying the same thing and using different words. And unless you are really deep into the literature, it sounds like they're talking past each other, but in fact, they're actually saying the same thing. I think that this is an area where, yes, a society would bring benefit by just getting people to agree on certain key tenets of the framework, certain key definitions, certain key objectives, and then you could sort of organize the literature along those lines as well. So that's, I believe that would be a useful exercise.
So shifting the gears a bit towards managerial agency, as humans, we have this innate need to tell stories that extol heroes and reinstates our faith in human action as the source of control in a seemingly chaotic world. Of course, the corporate parallel is that of stories of leaders like Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, and therefore our beliefs in managerial agency. You yourself have been a proponent of managerial agency and their role of individuals in creating dynamic capabilities, as opposed to just luck, for instance. Tell us more about this, and how, in contrast to mainstream economics, do you see managerial agency as being critical for firms as well as for economic development? I suppose much in line with the Penrosian view?
Well, that's a very good question. Well, first of all, economists don't really have managers in the equation at all. They certainly don't have entrepreneurs, but arguably they don't have managers, or to the extent to which managers are doing anything, they're just trying to suck wealth from the shareholder in their own direction. So there's a very narrow and limited view of the manager in economics. I do believe that individuals, and I actually prefer to say top management teams, make a huge difference. And this is where I sort of break a little bit from evolutionary economics, because evolutionary economics wants to put more of the sort of decision-making into routines and into standard operating procedures and so forth. And so my view of the business enterprise, to use your term, managerial agency, does matter. And dynamic capabilities in the top management team is very, very important. And it's, I'm actually just writing some stuff on this very recently. And, when you look at it, Elon Musk, for instance, there's no question that Tesla and SpaceX very much have the stamp of his individual actions and decisions and his willingness to bet his own money. So to suggest otherwise, I think is not tenable. So the problem, of course, is that from a theory building perspective, things start getting a little more ad hoc. We'd like to be able to routinize the role of the manager and the entrepreneur, but this is where I separate ordinary capabilities from dynamic capabilities, because the ordinary capabilities aren't so much about managerial agency, but dynamic capabilities are very much about managerial agency. That's not to say that elements of dynamic capabilities cannot be driven and supported by routines. They are. I mean, the whole, scanning the environment and sensing opportunities and setting processes in place for knowledge management. Knowledge management processes are part of what I call sensing. And with respect to seizing, I find it interesting that I can line up quotes between John Maynard Keynes writing about investors in the 30s and Jeff Bezos. This is John Maynard Keynes' idea of animal spirits, which is, when you come to a theoretical dead end, when the economists can't explain why it is that people invest with deep uncertainty, Keynes coined this term, it's the animal spirits of investors. And I suppose you could say it's the animal spirits of managers too, although they may be investing other people's money. But in some cases, as with Bezos and Musk and so forth, they're clearly investing their own money too. So I think it's a cop-out to sort of stop the analysis. I think we have to think about how to put this class of investor managers and entrepreneur managers into the model. And, I think you can do so around styles of decision-making and bold decision-making and so forth. And that's where I've been spending some time recently. And there's a much bigger role for agency and dynamic capabilities. And, Connie Helfat, I think, likewise, has got a much larger role for agency than some of the other scholars. And I think the longer you live in business schools and close to managers and looking at companies, the greater weight you tend to put on agency, because you do see the criticality of top management decision making. But it's not necessarily any one team. We know that with Steve Jobs, it was not just Jobs, it was a whole bunch of other people inside the company that, helped him do what he did. But at the same time, you do have to give credit to the top management team and to key people at certain times.
So when talking about investing money, dynamic capabilities seems to have been a guiding principle both for your academic career, but also for your business adventures. So you have mentioned setting up an investment fund that invests in young ventures utilizing dynamic capabilities as your main evaluation criterion. Your exact words being, you put your money where your mouth is. So could you please tell us more about this?
Look, I think the other thing about dynamic capabilities is that in a way, I've tried to express and make explicit some of my own personal managerial traits, which, pay certainly attention to data, but, if you're waiting for the data to be precisely dished up to you so that the decision is made by some clear financial metric, you never make a decision, or if you do make a decision, you're going to be too late. So yes, I've built 3 companies now, and I think I don't use the word dynamic capabilities to express what I've done inside of them, but I could, if one sat down, I could easily write, a chapter or 2 on each that would express a lot of the actions and the key decisions being animated by dynamic capabilities. And so the ultimate test, of course, of dynamic capabilities is, does it give you an insight into investing? And so I have 2 things, one that I've not yet done, but one that I'm doing. One is I'd like to set up a fund to invest in public securities that would use dynamic capabilities as a guide to investing. And I've actually, written up a fair amount and done a little bit of empirical work to show that actually is viable and I think will produce higher returns. The thing I'm concretely doing is I'm setting up a venture fund called Pilatus Investments, where we're using very much not just the dynamic capabilities framework, but also the profiting from innovation framework. Because what I find when I look at new ventures, the number of times that there is a weakness in the business model around value capture is striking to me. It is one thing to create great technology and have a great vision for a product and its impact, but it's quite another to think in a very clever way in a world of rapid imitation about how to protect that technology and how to capture value. So I find in the venture fund context, the profiting from innovation framework is probably the leading contributor to what I do differently from other VCs. But at the point at which I launch a public equities fund, it's unquestionably going to be dynamic capabilities. And I do take delight, I'm not a stock picker. I follow the tenets of modern finance, which is basically to be an index funds, except for when I see something where the market blatantly misreads what's going on. And I saw that with Apple early on. I saw that with Netflix and a couple of other companies. And I did put my money where my mouth was. And I also follow the mantra of being a long-term investor. And I've still got those positions. There's only a handful of them, but I think if you're looking more regularly, probably once a quarter, you would find something where the market really, in my view, has it wrong because they don't understand some element of dynamic capabilities or maybe profiting from innovation. So that's in the fun future, but I'm excited by it.
So you've often been called a practicing business intellectual because you've both a successful businessman as well as an incredible prolific scholar. So given that your business was so successful, how did that part of your life evolve, starting with the very first entrepreneurial venture? And what made you stay in academia after that?
Well, that's a good question. Yeah, a lot of people in academia have no idea that actually 3/4 of my life is spent actually building companies. Because when I'm on campus, I leave that behind. But this has been able to work for me because I see the connections between the two. I mean, quite frankly, my decisions in building a business and the way I've managed have been very much informed by the literature. I don't have to go hire a consultant. And it does give you confidence around decision making. If you've seen 100 case studies on something and you've read a couple of dozen articles on a phenomena, and you've maybe even contributed to that literature yourself, if a decision comes up in the neighborhood of that, you already have a compass. It's not to say that the literature is always right, but at least you can frame the problem, and what the conventional wisdom is. So in the company I currently have right now, the Berkeley Research Group, we've done things very differently. And so today, my mantra is frequently, on a going forward basis, beware regression to the mean, because as the organization grows, everyone, the natural force is to make us look like every other company that's out there, because the more people you hire, the more familiar with the rest of the world, the mean will percolate to the top. So maintaining points of difference is actually quite hard. But I've been able to, I think, exploit, if that's the right word, or leverage is probably a better word, the literature to help me make managerial decisions, and to help me, formulate strategy. But it's also gone the other way, because I've experienced things, and it's not just the building of the company that I've experienced things, but we have a lot of clients. And so I'm dealing with client problems all the time, and you're meeting with people, and importantly, you're looking at the documents and data from companies all the time. So it becomes a wonderful filter. In the academic literature, when I read it, 2/3 of it, people really don't know what they're talking about, honestly. which is good at one level because that means the amount I have to read is dramatically reduced. But one way to make sure you know what you're talking about is to look at data and to look at documents. And you know, some of the work that I've done in complex litigation has been very instructive because you get to see up close what actually is going on relative to what people think is going on. So sitting in the middle has been very valuable to me. But there's no point sitting in the middle if you don't reflect upon it. And so I think my writing has been assisted by the experience that I've had and the phenomena that I've had the privilege to look at, you know, often paid for by somebody else. So it's you know, there's a productivity booster in there that in doing the one, you actually develop knowledge that helps you in the other. So that's why it's the economies of scope, if you will, or the synergies, whatever word you want to use between the two, that you have to be disciplined to exploit. They don't fall naturally. I mean, I find in the Berkeley Research Group, I've got to push on people to get them to write up some of the things that they've learned and some of the things that they've studied, which is, you know, very useful and insightful for a broader audience. Of course, there's often issues of confidentiality, but you can sometimes work around them. But the discipline of actually writing it up so that it's transferable knowledge, if you don't do that, then that's a loss, an individual loss, but it's also a loss to the broader, you know, community of people who are researching these issues and want to do something productive with them.
So talking about writing, of the vast body of academic work that you have contributed to, what do you consider the greatest academic achievement? If we disregard any matrix based on citation count, what piece of work are you the most proud of and why?
Well, it's a hard question. Well, the thing that's really been central to my research, as I said before, was putting innovation front and center. And I know at Berkeley, I got innovation and entrepreneurship into the business school, and it's now kind of the core of how Haas distinguishes itself. You know, besides its values, it's the innovation entrepreneurship focus. I think in the field of strategic management, I help get at least the innovation piece, you know, into the literature. You know, in competition policy, which is an area of public policy I actively work in, I've been pushing very hard for 30 years with limited success with this concept I call dynamic competition. I say our public policy should be animated not by static competition, which is what you get from sort of standard microeconomics, but by innovation-driven competition, which is sort of the Schumpeterian perspective. And, you know, actually right now, there's suddenly an audience for that. So after 30 years of picking away at that and getting almost no traction, suddenly with a focus on big tech, there's at least an audience. Whether it affects policy or not, it's another story. So I would say, you know, I'm proud of the fact that I've got innovation front and center. I'm proud of the fact that I've made some of the issues, the streams of research more interdisciplinary than they might have otherwise been. You know, in terms of what my best work is, you know, there's a sort of an elegance relevance trade-off. And, you know, if to many academics, the best work is the most elegant work. And for me, my most elegant work is, I'd say, economies of scope and the scope of the enterprise and the profiting from innovation, particularly profiting from innovation, because that's a really succinct, simple model, if you will, or simple paradigm that really addresses a big question and it gives you some tools for thinking about how pioneers, or why pioneers so often lose, and what pioneers need to do if they want to win commercially in the marketplace. And of course, just about everybody does. So they're elegant, sweet, well-defined papers. Dynamic capabilities, I think, obviously is a different type of contribution, and the contribution there does not come from its elegance, but it comes from its ambition, which is to answer the most fundamental question, as I see it, in the field of strategic management, which is what explains how you build and maintain durable competitive advantage over time. That is the question. Porter's Five Forces doesn't even attempt to address that question. Resource-based theory of the firm is a static version of this. Is trying to answer the question, how do you have a competitive advantage? But for me, dynamic capabilities takes that and tries to make it dynamic. Because we're not just interested in a point in time, we're interested in renewing and refreshing and expanding and scaling success. So, probably in the end, if I can make it more elegant, it'll be dynamic capabilities. And very, very, central set of ideas, not just, by the way, not just for understanding how to build and maintain competitive advantage at the firm level, but there's an individual level analog for that as well. How do you as individuals have dynamic capabilities? And then there's a nation state level. And, the literature, I'm interested now to see a number of people writing on how do you make governments and government organizations more dynamically capable. And that's exactly, what you need in a time of COVID. I mean, as soon as COVID hit, I had 4 things that you should do that I knew we were not going to do, but were consistent with the dynamic capabilities framework. So when you think about it, dynamic capabilities is really about learning. And so it's kind of like it's strengths and weaknesses. It's a universal tool. There's hardly an issue that you can't apply it to. In terms of the basic steps of, assessing a situation, sizing it up, making a decision, and then, there's always going to be reaction to the decision, responding to that, and then transforming because the decision is right for one moment, won't necessarily be right for the next. So it ties in with the whole OODA loops, which is what the Air Force uses to train pilots. It ties in with lean startup. It ties in to some important degree with evolutionary economics. It ties in with a lot of work on leadership. It ties in with ambidexterity. It ties in with a knowledge-creating firm. But if we can make these connections a bit more explicit, I think there will be much better dialogue, not just by academics across disciplines, but I think there'll be much better decision making in industry and in governments. So that's where I hope it's all going, and we sure as heck need dynamic capabilities also in the political system to continue to renew and forge ahead.
So talking about academic contributions, I just got a question from the audience about your reflection process. So the person asks if you keep a research diary where you jot down your daily observations and reflections, or how do you keep track of your ideas?
That's a very good question. The answer is not very well. It's really more how do I keep track of other people's ideas. My own ideas, I kind of typically don't forget them, although sometimes I do. But trying to stay up, when I'm building companies and managing companies and launching a private, a venture fund, and doing lots of other things, and actively involved in consulting with, I got clients and so forth. Staying on top of the literature is actually hard. So keeping up with other people's ideas is the biggest challenge I have. And apologies to everybody who may be listening that I should have cited their work and I didn't somewhere along the way. I'm always happy to be reminded of things that I should have referenced and didn't. I think, I have a thank you to the Haas School. I've got a postdoc, Greg Linden, who is very, very helpful in archiving other people's papers, and it gives me a little bit of a leg up, and will read my material and help remind me of what I said somewhere else. But I usually remember what I said somewhere else, or at least I knew I said it somewhere else. Finding where I said it somewhere else is obviously a simple search, and I'll usually get to it. So there is there is a significant challenge when there's so much literature, and I'm cutting across so many different problem areas. It is a challenge. So the answer is, I'm a bit chaotic in that area, and if anyone's got any good ideas about how I can set up my own knowledge management system better, I would appreciate them.
So we have another question from audience actually, and since we are already talking about, we have been talking about dynamic capabilities and profiting from innovation. So Farooq wants to ask you, could you please ask about the profiting from innovation framework revisited and dynamic capabilities in connection to digital economy platforms and ecosystems?
Yeah, well, that's area of my current research with Nicholas Pettit at the European University. And look, I think dynamic capabilities is relevant in several ways. First of all, it comes back to the question that you put to me earlier about managerial agency. So much of the literature on platforms has this sort of simple, those that get ahead stay ahead. There's no role for managerial agency. But my sense when I look at, big tech, if you don't have strong dynamic capabilities, getting ahead doesn't mean staying ahead at all. And the sort of notions of tipping points that are sort of mathematically determined, I think is pure nonsense. And I think any good scholar in the field of strategic management should question the sort of tipping points as being inexorably set by scale factors and network effects. Look, certainly they have a role, no question about it. But every good platform has to face competition sooner or later from another good platform. As Gordon, Andy Grove at Intel, who was another person I got to know quite well, wrote this book, Only the Paranoid Survive, which is, you can read that as saying it's only if you got really strong dynamic capabilities and they're constantly sensing, seizing, and transforming and doing it, sensibly that you have a chance of surviving. That from the outside, policymakers looking in, this looks like, there's some kind of natural advantage that's inexorable. And it's definitely not the case. Yes, there certainly are advantages, and maybe you get a second chance if you've got a strong platform and a big user base. But managerial agency matters. So that's the first point I would make. And the capturing value and profiting from innovation framework, I think is relevant, and it ties in with business model design. Of course, with platforms, there's choices as to which side, which side of the market you're going to make your money on, and in some cases, you give away something free in one place and you charge for it elsewhere, which turns a lot of traditional economics on its head. But once again, if you don't get the business model right, and keep it right, because it's not just about getting it right up front, it's about keeping it right. And then it's also about harvesting data and using data. And if you don't do that smart, if you don't have the best, or at least really top, software engineers and top computer scientists, you're going to lose the leadership position. So I think understanding the role of big data and big data management and data orchestration and data transfer and data reuse, then you're not going to understand these platforms very well either. So I think there's enormous benefit, and this is where I think most of the audience today is strategic management scholars. You should pay some attention to the public policy debates going on, and and see if there's a way to contribute, because I think there's an absence of professionals looking at competition policy to know anything about management. And they essentially, the policymakers put very little weight on managerial agency. And because of that, they're probably going to craft policy which is not ideal.
We have a question more about the audience. From some of our previous conversations, you have talked briefly about how you consider yourself a business historian, or an amateur business historian at least. And the person writes that history is essentially about the explanation of change over time. How does history, business economics, and so forth factor into your research and writings?
Yes, well, I had the good fortune of knowing Alfred Chandler pretty well and reading with great interest what he had written. I think there's always a benefit from a historical perspective in two ways. One, there are lessons from the past. I mean, reading Alfred P. Sloan's book, My Years at General Motors, I mean, I still assign a chapter or two of that. I mean, the classic story, for instance, of the copper-cooled engine, which is the air-cooled engine, which they tried to develop in the 30s, and the problems that they had commercializing that because of disputes between the divisions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there are classic business problems that are there in the history books. And, you know, managers today keep making the same stupid management mistakes, you know, and I always say to myself, if you'd only read Alfred Chandler or something, you wouldn't do this. So these narratives, I mean, a lot of people emphasize the importance of narratives, and business history's got a lot of narratives, and I can tell you, it's even if it doesn't inform the decision, if you're talking to executives and they're talking to you about a problem and you mention something from history, that's a real world thing, just like a case study, they will listen to you a lot more eagerly than if you give them some theoretical proposition. So business history is rich with narratives. If you can pull them out at the right time, you know, for at least educating managers, I think it's valuable, but also for mentoring executives, it's valuable. But also for me as a scholar, it's once again, you know, I mentioned earlier how being an active consultant to industry became a filter for common sense. You know, I think reading business history and understanding some of those lessons also gives you an additional filter. But it's not about reading everything. There's a lot of dry and dusty stuff that's not particularly interesting, but you know, I think there's a lot from business history, and it's shocking to me that I think Harvard Business School still has a business history professor around, but I know we don't at Haas, and I think that's a major shortcoming. I don't think most business schools put anywhere near the emphasis on history that they should.
So we have just another audience question before we move on. So this one says that would Dr. Teece still see academia as a launch pad for other ventures, or has it become more specialized in the decades since he left graduate school?
Look, I think the academia, by that we mean the university, is, look, I think the best thing a university can do is provide you with a great education and good networks. So, you know, I'm not necessarily of the view, you know, like Peter Thiel thinks you should skip academy and just go straight into new ventures. I don't believe that. I actually, at least my own life experience, is, you know, you can get smart quickly through, you know, through learning in school. There's things you can learn through the literature and through academic pursuits, is so long as you don't get into the mindset of being very sort of down in the weeds, but you take away the right lessons from that. I think the university education is still incredibly valuable. I think an MBA is a valuable degree. I think a PhD is even better, because with a PhD, you get to challenge conventional wisdom. All you do with an MBA is you just get to learn what conventional wisdom is. You don't get much of that rigorous questioning and criticizing and pulling apart other people's theories. It's, here's a set of tools, learn them. I actually think a PhD is more valuable business education. McKinsey, which used to be very anti having any PhDs, they would just throw them in the same pot as MBAs. I think now McKinsey hires PhDs and puts them on a separate path from MBAs, and so they should. And it maybe is a longer career that, to show productivity as a PhD, it may take you a bit more time to get seasoned, but when you do get seasoned with practice and you've got those critical abilities that you learned from doing research, then you're a powerful weapon as an individual, so long as you're able to, to act and do. It's not just about thinking and writing, it's about doing. And if you're not a person of action, then you won't be successful. But if you're a person of thought and reflection and a person of action, which is what dynamic capabilities requires, then I think the sky's the limit, or there is no limit.
So coming back to exploring your scholarly journey once again, in one of our earlier conversations, we discussed the Napa Valley Strategy Conference in the 1990s. How do you think your work over the years has influenced the evolution of the field of strategy and is likely to do so going forward? Yeah, well, the Napa Strategy Conference, and that's where Dick Ramelt and Dan Schendel were key players in putting that on. The purpose there was actually to do a little bit of what we were talking about before, which is sort of bringing some common ground to strategy, to the field of strategic management by defining the field around, fundamental questions and figuring out what those fundamental questions were. What was going on about that time, and that was sort of the late 80s, if I remember, early 90s, game theory had come up, and there were a lot of people saying, well, strategy's just got to become game theory. And I thought, this is not right. I mean, it can't be so. I mean, game theory is just that, it's game theory. And yes, should one, have the capacity to think in terms of actions and reactions, of course you should. But I was not at all convinced that game theorists had much to say that was really going to deeply enrich the field of strategy. Yes, on pricing decisions and certain narrow questions, absolutely yes. And so part of the idea was to let the game theorists tell us what they could do to enrich the field of strategy. And the answer is they couldn't tell us very much at all. And I think there was somewhat of a loss of enthusiasm behind game theory as the key engine to drive the field of strategic management, because it really blunted its pick on the fundamental questions. Game theory didn't answer any of those fundamental questions at all. And most game theoretic models, you change the assumption and they fall over. So practically all of them are very non-robust. So you need something that's a bit more robust. It would have been nice if game theory could deliver on the promise, and it has in certain narrow areas, auction design and so forth, very, very important. But there's other areas where it's not contributed at all. So the question is, is there a need for this all over again? Yeah, probably. I think from time to time, a field needs to come together to double down on what the fundamental questions are, and maybe they're a little bit different. If the ones you got last time are truly fundamental, they should still be fundamental. They should survive the test of time. But there's always new dimensionality. For instance, the rule of law or global open economic system
is now challenged by the rise of China and in a different set of rules. And so, and I've been writing on this in the field of international business. I think most of our models of international business need to be thought through all over again, because when you have public enterprises and they're not sort of for profit, but the goal is for the nation state, competing with firms that are for profit, you have a very different circumstance. And so rethinking theory is absolutely required. So yes, it's probably time again to revisit fundamental issues. And I think there would be benefit from doing so.
So almost coming to a close now, we have touched upon your contributions to strategy and many other fields today. But what legacy would you like to leave behind? What would you like to be remembered for, both by the academic and the practitioner community?
Well, the two would be nice if those two communities were fused a bit more seamlessly to begin with. And by that, I mean, I wish the appetite in business for academic ideas and great contributions, there's a lot of learning that I think is missed, because business doesn't take in very fast a lot of the learning in academia and vice versa. So I probably answered that before by saying that I think that it would be good to keep innovation front and center, understand that innovation is not just a driver of individual firm prosperity and longevity, but it's also the driver of economic growth, and whichever nation controls the technologies of the future, be it 5G, 6G, robotics, biotech, and so forth. And there's geopolitical implications from all of this that are absolutely a massive proportion. So I'm sort of, I'd like to think that we can keep Adam Smith relevant. And some of you may know that I held this big conference at Adam Smith's home in Edinburgh in July of 2019. And, Adam Smith wrote two books, one, The Wealth of Nations, and the other one was A Theory of the Moral Sentiments. And these are useful guides for today, particularly the theory of the moral sentiments. I mean, what's, I think, happened that we haven't talked about much in the field of strategic management, but I think that the business enterprise in actuality is focused because of so-called shareholder pressure and shareholder activists, on short-term results. And, innovation requires a long-term focus. So I think a lot of our governance structure, I think that boards of directors are just not willing to stand up against certain shareholder activists that actually would quite happy to see the R&D budget cut and firms focus on the next 2 quarters, and that's it. And then they're out of the stock. So strategic management needs to engage with questions in governance. Now, there's very little in the field of strategic management on governance. There should be a lot. It's a neglected area, in my view. So finding scholars that can tie all this together so that we can, as a field, put some leadership out there and have an impact on public policy, as well as on managerial decisions. I think that's the challenge for the field. And to the extent to which, my work can contribute to that by helping people see those cross connections and providing a pathway, a research pathway to do so, then I'll be happy. Because in the end, we can no longer take for granted the open, free system, democratic system. We've all got to double down on supporting democracy. It's threatened from the outside by autocracies, and it's threatened from the inside. And some of you may have seen a piece, an op-ed I did in the New York Times a month or so ago, where I said there is the corporate social responsibility. One of the key corporate social responsibilities should be around maintaining democracy. We've taken that for granted. We've taken the rule of law for granted. It's sort of part of the platform that we assume is in place when we do our research. We can no longer do that, sadly. So it's time for us to show that we're real scholars and that we can embed our research in these broader set of global issues that are now confronting us. And I'm sure some members of the field will, but there's no question that we can't continue to do research in the future the way we have in the past.
Well, this has been a truly inspiring conversation. Professor Teece, it has been an absolute pleasure talking to you today. We greatly appreciate the time and effort that you have invested in making the interview possible, and we hope that all our participants have enjoyed it as much as we have. We would especially like to thank participants joining in from Europe and Asia because, of course, the odd hours in these regions. But thank you, everyone, again.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I appreciated it.